Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're looking into the case of Samuel Little.
Samuel Little, one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history.
Exactly. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Another true crime story. Haven't we heard them all? But trust me, this one is different. What's so fascinating about this case is how Little's confessions are actually being used to solve cold cases across the country.
Yeah, and, with the FBI already confirming he was involved in at least 60 of the 93 murders he confessed to, it's really unbelievable.
It's mind-boggling, and it really highlights how he managed to stay under the radar for so long. Little mainly targeted women on the fringes of society, right? Often sex workers or drug users, people whose disappearances might not have even been noticed at the time. It's tragic.
Really is.
And then there's the fact that he actually drew these incredibly detailed portraits of his victims.
Oh, yeah, I read about that.
Some of those drawings, believe it or not, have actually helped identify victims and solve cases that had gone cold for decades.
Wild. So, where are we starting with this?
Well, we've got a lot of material to dig through today. We'll be looking at excerpts from his Wikipedia page, covering everything from his early life and crimes to, well, his death.
Okay.
And we'll also be incorporating some media coverage that sheds more light on this whole complex story.
Sounds good.
Let's start at the beginning, shall we? With his early life, Samuel Little was born in 1940.
1940, okay.
And get this, he was abandoned by his mother, who was a prostitute, and ended up being raised by his grandmother. Imagine the impact of an upbringing like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not an excuse for what he did, but you can't help but wonder, right, about how his childhood might have played a role.
Absolutely. And there's this one detail that just stuck with me. Little actually claimed that his fascination is pretty disturbing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
His fascination with choking began in kindergarten.
Wow, in kindergarten.
Yeah, he said he saw his teacher touch her neck, and it just triggered something in him. Disturbing, isn't it? You must start to see these patterns, these tendencies, even at such a young age.
It makes you think, like, was this a sign of something deeper going on, something psychologically that eventually led him down this horrible path?
Hard to say for sure, but it certainly adds another layer to his story. And, when you look at his criminal history, it really paints a clear picture of escalating violence. Like, in 1982, he was actually tried for murder.
He was.
He was, but get this, he was acquitted.
Whoa.
Because of a lack of evidence, even though there were witnesses who testified against him. How crazy is that?
That's just chilling, that he could be that close to being brought to justice and just slip through the cracks like that.
It really makes you realize how cunning he was, And he knew how to manipulate the system. He often targeted victims who, tragically, were less likely to be missed if they disappeared. Eventually, he moved to California, and that's where he was eventually convicted, but just for assault and kidnapping. It's like you can see the progression, the crimes getting more and more serious.
Right, yeah, like a pattern of escalation.
And this all leads us to his capture in 2012. It's almost ironic how it happened. He was arrested for a narcotics charge, something relatively minor, but then they ran his DNA, and it linked him to 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles. That was it. Game over.
Wow. So it was just a total accident.
Pretty much, and that's what really set everything in motion.
So what happened next?
Well, after they caught him, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
Okay, makes sense.
But then things are really interesting. Little starts confessing. 2 murders all across the country.
What? Why would he do that? He's already in prison for life.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And he wasn't just confessing to a few murders. We're talking dozens. The thing is, he offered a deal, right? In exchange for a prison transfer, he'd spill the beans. And he didn't just give vague details. He provided specific information, dates, locations even. He drew those portraits we talked about earlier.
Oh, wow, to help identify the victims?
Exactly.
I think he wanted to be remembered as this record-breaking serial killer.
Maybe he did. So anyway, naturally the FBI got involved.
Yeah?
And they had this huge task ahead of them. They had to corroborate all of his claims. And that's where those portraits became incredibly valuable. Imagine you're a detective, right? Working on a cold case for years with absolutely no leads, and suddenly you have this confession in a drawing, a detailed drawing that matches the victim. It's got to be both a breakthrough and absolutely horrifying.
I can't even imagine.
All those years of not knowing, and then suddenly closure, but at what cost?
Heavy stuff.
It's a testament to, forensic science, to good old-fashioned detective work. But it also forces us to confront some hard truths about our society, right?
What do you mean?
Well, so many of Little's victims were these marginalized women. They were often overlooked by society, by law enforcement. It's like their lives were somehow seen as less valuable. And Little exploited that.
That's awful.
Their lives mattered just as much as anyone else's, but their disappearances often went unnoticed, or they were just dismissed.
Heartbreaking.
It is. So let's take a look at some specific cases that were actually solved because of Little's confessions.
Okay, yeah.
There's one that really stands out, Melinda Rose Lepre.
Linda Rose Lepre.
Little was actually investigated for her murder back in 1982, but a grand jury didn't indict him. It wasn't until he confessed years later that her case was finally reopened.
Wow.
Imagine the bittersweet victory for her family after all those years.
Yeah, must have been a lot to process. What about some other cases?
Well, there's Denise Christie brothers. Murdered in Texas in 1994, Little's confession led to another life sentence for him, but more importantly, it brought some sense of closure to her loved ones. And then there's Melissa Thomas. Her murder back in 1996 was particularly brutal.
Oh, gosh.
But his confession to her fatal strangulation finally brought some peace to her family. And these are just a few of the many, many lives that Little's destroyed. It's crucial that we remember that behind the statistics, the headlines, there are real people, people who were loved and are still mourned.
Absolutely. And that's where the media comes in, right? I mean, they play a crucial role in humanizing these victims and keeping their stories alive.
Exactly. And there's this writer, Gillian Lauren, who actually investigated Little and interviewed him extensively in prison. She was able to gain his trust in a way that no one else could.
That's amazing.
I know, right? It's incredible work. She gives us this glimpse, this unsettling glimpse into the mind of a serial killer. And it's not about glorifying him or anything like that. It's about trying to understand, the dark complexities of human behavior.
So maybe try to prevent something like this from happening again.
Exactly. And then there's this documentary series, Confronting a Serial Killer. It features Gillian Lauren's work, and it does a really great job of examining the societal factors, the things that allowed Little to operate for so long.
Oh, okay, like the context.
Exactly. It's a must-watch for anyone interested in this case. It's tough to watch, for sure, but important.
I could see that.
Little's case sparked a lot of discussion about the vulnerability of marginalized women, and how law enforcement, how they need to do better. It's a wake-up call, I think. We have to pay closer attention to these cases, investigate them thoroughly, and ensure that all victims receive justice no matter who they are, where they come from.
Totally agree.
It's a conversation that definitely needs to continue. We're back, and man, I gotta say, trying to understand the mind of Samuel Little is a really disturbing experience. Before we took a break, we were talking about Little's victims and the systemic issues that allowed him to get away with his crimes for so long. But let's go back to those confessions. He confessed to so many murders. Why do you think he did that? Was it like remorse or a desire for attention, for infamy?
Yeah, it's a question that stumped a lot of people. It's important to remember he was already serving multiple life sentences. So what did he have to gain?
Right.
Some criminologists believe that it was his way to still have some sort of control, even from prison.
Interesting.
Like he was in control of revealing those horrible acts on his terms.
Makes sense. It's almost like he was creating his own legacy, his own twisted legacy.
Right. And think about the power dynamics, right? Like he held information that law enforcement really needed. So he was in a position to negotiate, to bargain,
It's a scary thought, really. Even while confessing, he was still manipulating the system.
Exactly.
What about those drawings? We talked about them a bit earlier, but they're so central to this whole case. They're haunting, they're detailed, and they were the key to identifying so many victims who had been, nameless for years.
Yeah, the level of detail in those drawings it's fascinating and creepy at the same time. It really suggests some complex psychological relationship with his victims.
Like he almost wanted to memorialize them.
Right. He remembered their faces, little details about them, sometimes even their clothing.
It's like he wanted to preserve them in his own way.
Yeah, it's this weird contradiction. On one hand, he's taking these women's lives, and then on the other hand, he's so carefully recreating their images. It really makes you wonder about his motives and his mental state.
Like some sort of morbid type of remembrance, but it's through these drawings that we can start to piece together a better picture of the victim themselves. And as we've said, many of them were marginalized women who were overlooked by society. What can you tell us about their lives?
Well, it's important to emphasize that each of these women had their own story, a life outside of their encounter with Samuel Little's. You know what I mean? They were daughters, they were mothers, sisters, friends. They had, hopes and dreams just like anyone else. And it's just tragic, that their lives were cut short. One of the victims is Dorothy Richards.
Dorothy Richards.
Little confessed to her murder in 1982. It happened in Florida. And because of his confession and his drawing, they were finally able to identify her remains in 2019.
It's just a reminder that these weren't just names on a list. They were real people. They had families who wondered for years, for decades, what happened to them.
Absolutely. Another case that shows this is the murder of Rosie Hill.
Rosie Hill.
Back in 1993, Little met her at a bus stop in Mississippi, and he confessed to strangling her. They were able to identify her remains in 2015, again thanks to his confession. These are just a couple examples, but they show how tragic this case really is.
It's just the scope of it all is mind-blowing, and it's really through the work of journalists and filmmakers that we can begin to understand the full impact of Little's crimes. We mentioned Gillian Lauren before and the Confronting a Serial Killer documentary. Why is their work so important to this case?
Well, Gillian Lauren's ability to connect with Little is really amazing. Like, she got him to open up in ways that even law enforcement couldn't. And through her interviews, we get a glimpse, even if it is disturbing, into the mind of a serial killer.
Yeah.
And it's not to glorify him. It's more to understand the complexities of, human behavior.
It's to gain insights that might prevent future tragedies.
Yeah. And the Confronting a Serial Killer series goes even further. It not only focuses on his crimes, but it also explores, the societal context surrounding those crimes. Like, it looks at the systemic failures that allowed him to prey on these vulnerable women for so long.
Right. It shows that there are bigger issues at play.
Yeah,
It's a powerful reminder that we need to address these systemic issues if we want to stop this from happening again.
absolutely.
We need to make sure that marginalized communities are protected and that their voices are heard.
And it goes beyond just law enforcement. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and valued.
Right, where people don't just disappear without anyone noticing,
Exactly.
where their lives aren't just thrown away. It's a huge challenge, but one we need to face head on. Now, before we wrap things up, let's turn our attention back to the listeners. We've gone over a lot in this deep dive, from Samuel Little's life and crimes to those chilling confessions and the drawings that helped bring closure to families. What stands out to you most about this case? What questions are you left with?
It's hard to pick just one thing. I mean, the sheer number of victims is just staggering, obviously. But what I keep coming back to is, like, why did he confess? What's the psychology behind that? Why would someone who's already going to spend the rest of his life in prison want to reveal all these awful things he did?
It's the big question, isn't it? Was it about control? Did he want notoriety? Or was there maybe just a tiny bit of remorse somewhere deep down?
Who knows? It's impossible to say for sure. But I think those confessions, and especially those detailed drawings, they really point to some kind of, I don't know, complex, messed up relationship with his victims. Like, he wanted to wipe them away, but also keep a record of them in this really twisted way.
It's a pretty disturbing thought. And it brings us back to those victims, those women who were so marginalized, so overlooked. We can't forget them. Their stories, their lives, they help us understand the real devastating impact of Little's crimes.
Yeah, their lives mattered, and we have to remember them, not just as victims, but as, as individuals, with families, with dreams, with people who loved them.
We have to keep telling their stories. And, hopefully by looking at the things that allowed Little to get away with his crimes for so long, we can try to prevent something like this from happening again.
Right, exactly. Like, it's not just about catching the killer. It's about fixing the problems in our society that make certain people more likely to experience violence. It's about building a society where everyone feels safe and valued and protected.
It's a huge task. But we got to face it. We got to demand better from our justice system, from our communities, from each other. Everyone deserves a voice. No one should be forgotten.
And we can't stop asking questions. Like, why was Little able to evade capture for so long? What can we learn from this, from his story, to stop this from happening again?
These are important questions. If you're interested in learning more, do some dig. Read about Little's victims. Their lives mattered, and they should be remembered.
This has been a tough deep dive, a heavy one. But I hope it's also been, I don't know, eye-opening. It's a reminder that even in the worst parts of humanity, even in the darkest places, there are always things we can learn. And there's always hope. Thanks for listening, everyone.